Hi and welcome back to all distance students and obviously attending students who missed the lecture this week. I should briefly explain why we're having these particular additional recordings. For me there's primarily two reasons. One, and certainly the most important, is an attempt to bring home some of the activities to those distance students who don't have the advantage of attending the campus. The other is simply to draw your attention to activities that haven't been in the unit before. These are additional units. The original recordings that you'll listen to, or at least the main recordings, recorded last semester. In this iteration of the unit, we've felt fit that we should actually add a lot greater body to the actual activities that are involved in the unit, and hence not only these recordings but also the additional material on the PowerPoints which are not mentioned in the main lecture. So if you could, and if you're interested, it'd be great if you could actually get involved. There'll be some weeks where where I may not record a lecture, particularly if the actual activity itself is fairly self-evident. You'll also find there are notes underneath some of the actual slides which indicate, particularly to the teaching staff, but also you can use them as well, what you might look at in terms of that activity and how you might approach it in terms of actually coming up with clues, or as part of an investigation into actually answering a question. So, coming to this week's activity, what I wanted to look at, and wanted you all to at least consider, was the notion of the encyclopedia. Now, certainly from my experience, and being nearly 50, I had quite a bit of experience with encyclopedias, certainly in book form when I was a lot younger. I was quite surprised to read recently that Encyclopaedia Britannica has decided to actually stop printing their obviously the Britannica version in book form. After 241 years, this is quite a big move, but also is fairly indicative of where not only publishing is today, but particularly where encyclopedias are. At a personal level, this was somewhat surprising, and I almost became nostalgic because I remember as a child having a set of encyclopedias at home on the shelf. From memory it was Mind Alive, which was I guess a version of an encyclopedia, but I found, certainly as a child, it great fun to rummage through and look at a whole range of different material that otherwise I wouldn't have been exposed, certainly not in the fairly conservative area that I grew up. And I have to confess that at the time I was more interested in the photographs and the odd caption or two rather than the actual text that went with the particular pictures. And given that there was literally thousands of photographs and diagrams, etc., and plans, maps, I had a lot to get on with in terms of just going through and browsing these tomes of knowledge. My interest extended to the point of going to the public library, and whenever I was bored or couldn't find anything I was particularly interested in, and given that I was in a fairly small town, the library was fairly easy to exhaust. I found the encyclopedias, always in the reference section, to be a bit of a magnet, so I could literally thumb through much better, more comprehensive versions of the encyclopedia that I had at home. That said, obviously the printed version of encyclopedias looks like it's on the way out, and perhaps for good reason. My hope is, with the discussion certainly on campus, I wanted to sort of extend, or at least ask people their views about the fact that printed versions of encyclopedias will probably no longer exist within the next 5 to 10 years. In fact, I think that would include all encyclopedias. But also I wanted to extend the argument, or at least the discussion, towards things like scrapbooks. Scrapbooks were a forerunner to encyclopedias, or at least complemented encyclopedias. But we now have newer versions of these things like Pinterest, which at least is a digital form of scrapbooking in a sense. And I guess what I'm interested in more broadly is these repositories, large repositories of information, often only containing small amounts of information about a lot of things. Are they of value today? And more broadly, are they seen in the same light? In other words, do people actually utilise these things? Now, arguably, you could say Wikipedia serves the online function that encyclopedias used to. I think it's in a slightly different form, with a whole lot of problems that I think I indicate at least quite strongly within the actual lecture. On slide 20 of the PowerPoint, I simply ask, what are the issues, limits of presenting information in the form of an encyclopedia? And if you look in the notes section underneath that slide, you'll see at least some of the, I guess, things that I would consider to be negatives relating to information presented in this way. I'd hope that you would take some time to actually have a think about it, just from the perspective of how information is presented, if nothing else. On slide 21, I asked the question, is Google just another encyclopedia? And again, if you look under the notes, you'll see several points that I'm highlighting that I think are worth actually considering in relation to Google. And don't worry, I haven't necessarily got it in for Google. I just think there are some fairly limiting factors around Google which are not often expressed or discussed. On slide 22, there's a link there for a TED Talk, and if you haven't heard many TED Talks, I'd highly recommend them. There are hundreds of different talks, and I would say very inspiring talks given by people around the world. I'll let you read about why TED Talks happen and how they came about. It's definitely worth looking at, and there's a lot of different subjects that are dealt with. And for me, I guess it's a fun way of finishing not only our ideas around encyclopedias, but also about information, and what information can bring us in terms of how we live and what we do. Anyway, explore the ideas around encyclopedias if you've got the time. I think it's worth contemplating, if nothing else, from nostalgia stake. Even if you haven't dealt with the printed version of encyclopedias, you probably have seen them in libraries in days gone by. Anyway, have a great week, and I'll talk to you next week. Thanks. Bye.